Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
Year after year, they forgot my birthday. At first, it stung like a cut you tell yourself will heal overnight, something you try to wave off with an awkward laugh when friends ask what you did to celebrate. But by the fifth year, the wound wasn't healing anymore, it was festering. And the silence from the people who were supposed to know me best turned into something that felt like deliberate erasure. You know the kind of erasure where someone looks straight at you but acts as if you're part of the furniture, useful maybe, but never celebrated. And here's the irony, I didn't grow up in some broken, scattered household where chaos made dates blur together. We were suburban, middle class, the kind of family that prided itself on milestones, that kept photo albums stuffed with Emily's cheerleading trophies and endless snapshots of her at dances, prom, her first car wash fundraiser. All carefully captioned by my mother in gold gel pen. My face appeared too, but like an afterthought. The cousin in the corner of the picture who clearly wasn't the point of the frame. The first forgotten birthday happened when I was in college. I came home for the weekend, lugging a backpack that weighed more than my entire sense of self-worth at that point, and I told myself, don't expect much. You're an adult now, it's different. But deep down, I wanted something, a cake, a candle, even a lousy happy birthday text at midnight. Nothing came. Instead, I found myself sitting across from my mother at breakfast while she scrolled her phone, reminding Emily about a sorority application deadline, while my dad, half distracted by the morning news, asked if I was still doing that internship thing. I remember stirring cold coffee and thinking maybe they were planning a surprise later, but the day slipped away, replaced with errands, family chatter about Emily's weekend plans. And not once did anyone say my name in connection to the date that was supposed to be mine. That night, I blew out a candle I stuck in a leftover brownie, alone in my dorm, and whispered a wish. That next year would be different. It wasn't. The second year, I tried to jog their memory, dropping hints a week before, saying I might want to grab dinner at that new Italian place. My mother said, "Oh honey, that week is crazy with Emily's finals, maybe after." After never came. My dad texted me a week later saying, "Sorry, we've been busy, let's celebrate soon," but his idea of celebrating was slipping me a $20 bill when I came home the following month, as though my life could be summed up with pocket change. Emily got a spa day that spring because she needed to de-stress. I needed to de-stress too, but apparently I didn't make the cut. By the third year, I started telling myself not to care. I worked late shifts, spent the day pretending the date was meaningless, but the truth is it gnawed at me every single hour. Friends at work said, "Hey, happy birthday. What's the plan?" And I shrugged, lying through my teeth, keeping it low-key, you know me. Except I didn't know me, and I knew I was the kind of person who wanted to be remembered, even if I pretended otherwise. When Emily got showered with gifts for her 21st, a weekend trip, matching necklaces from mom and dad, and a literal champagne toast in the living room, I sat there clapping, smiling, drinking cheap sparkling water, and something inside me started to harden. The fourth year, I tested them. I didn't call, didn't show up, didn't hint, nothing. My phone stayed on the nightstand, screen dark, and by the time midnight hit, I knew. Nobody texted. Nobody called. Not even a belated oops. At work, my boss gave me a slice of store-bought cake because someone had told her it was my birthday, and I swear the sugar made me tear up in the bathroom. My own boss, a woman who barely remembered my middle name, gave me more acknowledgement than my parents. By the fifth year, I thought maybe I'd grown numb, like scar tissue where the nerve endings don't sting anymore. But numbness has a way of fooling you, and the smallest touch can make it all hurt again. I walked into the house that weekend thinking, maybe this time, maybe they'll finally get it, maybe I'm not invisible. The place smelled like balloons and frosting, and for a split second, my chest filled with something like relief. I thought, finally, they remembered. But then I saw it, the streamers, the banner, the whole family gathered in the driveway, my father with his arm around Emily, my mother holding a set of keys with a grin that stretched ear to ear. Everyone was shouting, surprise, and Emily squealed, running toward the car with a bow on the hood. My birthday wasn't just forgotten this time, it was replaced. And standing there, clutching my overnight bag like a fool who had dared to hope again, I realized I had two choices. I could break down, make a scene, remind them of what they'd erased for half a decade, or I could keep the mask on my face, the smile stitched in place, and start planning something bigger than they could ever imagine. I chose silence because silence, when wielded right, is the sharpest blade. I didn't let the tears fall. I hugged Emily, told her I was happy for her, even joked about borrowing the car. They laughed, not realizing they'd just handed me the one gift I needed, the absolute certainty that I didn't owe them anything anymore. And in that moment, while cameras flashed around my sister and everyone gushed about leather seats and Bluetooth systems, I promised myself that the next chapter would belong to me. Because that fifth year wasn't the year they simply forgot. It was the year I started walking away, one step at a time, and they had no idea what was coming. The driveway looked like a dealership ad had swallowed our house whole and spit it back out with a bow, and while neighbors clustered at the curb doing that polite, open-mouthed marveling people reserved for new granite counters and surprise engagements. My mother shook the keys so hard the little leather fob flashed like a lighthouse, and my father kept patting Emily's shoulder as if applause alone could guarantee her safe miles and favorable interest rates. I stood in the half-shade near the mailbox with my overnight bag cutting into my wrist and realized the smell I had mistaken for frosting was actually new car plastic, that sweet synthetic promise of an improved life. And the laugh I bit down on was not kind because the punchline, as usual, was me. When everyone shouted, "Surprise!" I made the exact face they needed, the delighted sister face, the yes we are a normal family face, and I stepped forward to take photos, to frame their ecstasy with the kind of composition that turns into family lore, and I kept clicking, catching my mother's tilted chin and my father's widened stance and Emily's weepy disbelief, and if you looked closely you could see me reflected in the windshield like a faint watermark, the person who shot the proof and therefore did not properly exist in it. While they circled the car, I drifted to the driver's side under the pretense of admiring the dashboard, and when my mother pressed the fob into Emily's palm with a flourish, I was already pairing the Bluetooth to my phone, the screen greeting me with a cheerful corporate message about hands-free safety as if any device could keep a life like ours from crashing, and I renamed the connection to a harmless, almost goofy sentence that would haunt every ignition: "Happy birthday to the other daughter." Was it petty? Yes, and also wonderfully precise. It would live in the background where they had trained me to live, popping up every time the engine woke, a quiet mosquito tone reminding them that forgetting people costs something. Emily, who could turn a door handle into a performance, demanded that I sit in the passenger seat for the first spin, and I did, smiling while she tested the backup camera and ran her fingers over the steering wheel like a pianist trying out a new instrument. And when the infotainment screen blinked to life and the Bluetooth banner floated across it, she frowned, then laughed, assuming it was a quirky factory joke, and I said, very lightly, that the car must be sentimental. My mother said we should not jinx anything, touch wood, cross fingers, all the ritual nonsense of people who don't notice the actual human standing 5 inches away. I asked if we could do a quick toast before they peeled away for celebratory milkshakes, and my father, who adores any chance to hold a glass and pronounce things, clapped his hands to corral the crowd, and I took the decorative plastic cup someone shoved at me, felt the cheap rim dig into my palm, and said the most polite piece of sabotage I have ever spoken. I told Emily she deserved a safe ride and a sense of freedom and a long string of oil changes she would not forget, that a car is responsibility dressed up as independence, that insurance is a love language too, and I slid a thin, ribboned envelope toward her with a little grin that made the aunts giggle because they assumed it was a gas card, while my mother widened her eyes at the thoughtfulness she could later claim. Inside the envelope I had tucked a printed spreadsheet I made the night before, a simple page with line items that totaled the real cost of the gift, registration, taxes, monthly insurance for a new driver in our zip code, expected maintenance, tire rotations, and a conservative estimate for parking tickets I knew my sister would collect the way magpies collect tinfoil. Across the top I had written in neat, looping script, Lesson 1. Adulthood comes with receipts. Emily's mouth pinched as she traced the numbers, and she asked, with that bright, practiced innocence, whether the insurance had already been set up because she would hate to be unsafe, and my father, caught between pride and math, said of course they would handle it. While my mother performed relief so dramatic I almost applauded, except I was too busy finishing my first small revenge, which was not the envelope or the Bluetooth rename, but the photo I snapped at the moment their faces shifted. From pure triumph to the slightly pinched look of people calculating, a truthful picture I texted to our extended family thread with a caption that sounded sweet enough to pass any sniff test. Best part of my birthday weekend was seeing Emily so happy. I hit send and slipped the phone into my pocket, and within 30 seconds the thread began to burble like a pot that had been ignored too long. Cousins and great-aunts and people who send chain prayer messages on holidays chiming in with heart reactions and cheerful congratulations, and then, like clockwork, the predictable, innocent landmine, "Wait, it's your birthday too today?" Followed by a few more, "Oh my goodness, how lovely, a double celebration. Did you do cake for both girls? Tell your mom to post the side-by-side candles." The kind of questions that look harmless until you drop them into a house that runs on image management and selective amnesia. My mother's phone started pinging like a smoke alarm in a kitchen with too many onions in the pan, and she tried to smile through it, but embarrassment stains quickly, and while she fumbled replies my father asked me, a little too loudly, to get a group shot by the mailbox sign, his voice tight with the hope that a new, more palatable picture would overwrite the problem spiraling in his pocket. We took the shot. I framed it beautifully because I am nothing if not competent in the jobs nobody pays me for. Then I handed the phone back and let the afternoon take them wherever it wanted. Milkshakes and errands and selfie angles that made the hood look longer, and I walked into the quiet house to wash a sticky cup and collect my overnight bag and breathe the cool air that smelled like lemon cleaner and not balloons. And I told myself the truth I should have told myself 4 years ago. That invisibility is not a fate, it is a technique, and I could use it to move through this place without triggering alarms while I pulled my life out of their drawers one document at a time. In the hallway I paused at the family calendar, the glossy planner my mother worshipped, saw every square crammed with Emily's practices and my father's tea times and little flags for dental appointments, and next to today's date there was only the inked word surprise. No name, no reminder, no pin to mark the daughter who had somehow become an optional feature. I took the black marker from the pen cup, and with a hand steadier than felt sane, I wrote a single thin word in the smallest possible script. Not enough to catch a careless glance today, but impossible to unsee later. Me. Then I clicked the cap back on, slid the marker where it had been, and stepped into the driveway with my bag and my nicest smile, because I still had rides to offer and errands to run and a sister to cheer on as she merged into traffic. And because the clever thing about leaving is that you can start while everyone thinks you are staying. When Emily asked if I could hold the extra key for, just in case, I slipped it onto my ring like it weighed nothing at all and told her of course I had always been the safe pair of hands, and she laughed and said she trusted me more than anyone, which would have been touching if it had not also been proof that none of them knew me at all anymore. And I tucked the key against my palm, felt its small, cool edge, and knew precisely what I would do with it tomorrow. I woke before sunrise to a house that still smelled faintly of sugar and latex and showroom plastic, the kind of morning air that tricks you into believing the night solved something, and I padded down the hall without turning on lights, moving the way you move in a place you know too well, past the framed proofs of our public life, the cheer uniforms and graduation caps and lake trips, and I told myself that whatever felt tender last night needed to calcify today because planning requires a spine more than a heart. I made coffee in the quiet kitchen and opened my laptop to a checklist I had drafted months ago when the 4th year of forgetting taught me that hope is not a strategy, and as steam curled out of the mug I began migrating my existence one small, unglamorous step at a time, the way you move a life through a straw. I set up a postal box with a number that sounded like a clean beginning, filed the change of address request so bank statements and pay stubs would stop landing on a counter where anyone could skim, initiated a new checking account with two-factor authentication tied to my phone alone, exported my contacts, pruned the family group access to my calendar so no one would see when I stopped being available. And I installed backups of every photo where my face appeared, not to hoard what they ignored, but to refuse their monopoly on our history. From the living room, I removed myself like a magician who knows the real trick is misdirection. I lifted the frames where my smile hovered in the corner and replaced them with the default stock families that came with the frames. Those uncanny strangers with perfect teeth and ambiguous jobs joy, a swap so subtle no one would notice until a holiday, and even then they would argue about when that picture changed instead of why I had, which was the entire point. In my old room, I took the practical artifacts they never bothered to inventory: social security card, passport, a folder of immunization records my mother bragged about keeping for college forms, the high school transcripts she once told me would matter forever, and the stack of tax documents I had been filing like a responsible ghost, and I laid them into a waterproof envelope inside my tote. Not because I anticipated a flood, but because I was done treating my life like paper that could mildew in someone else's damp drawer. Every drawer I closed felt like tucking a chapter back into a book I would not loan out again, and every small motion steadied me for the one I knew would rattle them hardest, the motion that would look like kindness until it didn't. The extra key Emily had trusted me with lay on my nightstand against a hair tie, light as a coin and twice as useful, and when the sun edged the blinds I slipped it into my pocket and walked to the driveway, listening for voices, hearing only the soft suburban symphony of sprinklers and a distant delivery truck. I opened the car the way a valet opens possibility, slid into the driver's seat that still held the ghost of yesterday's perfume and laughter, and I told the dashboard in my head that this was not theft, it was pedagogy, and some lessons require a lab. I set the seat memory to a position that fit me, saved the profile under a name that would raise a pulse, other daughter, primary. Then I navigated to the system settings and enabled valet mode with a speed limit that would keep my sister from testing the laws of physics and a pin only I knew. I locked the glove box and trunk because responsibility should not be theoretical. Placed inside the glove box an envelope labeled, "In." The same looping script as yesterday, Lesson 2. Access comes with respect, and inside it I tucked the registration, the insurance card my parents would need to photograph for the app they bragged about not understanding, and a gas gift card loaded to a respectful amount that would prove I am not vindictive, merely thorough. Before I shut the compartment, I added a single sheet that looked like a riddle and read like a mirror, a list of 5 dates aligned with 5 empty bullet points under the heading, Things You Remember When You Love Someone, and I closed the door on it. Heard the cheap click that meant the simplest lock can still be decisive. Then I started the engine, and let the renamed Bluetooth pairing flare across the screen like a banner in a stadium where I never got to play. I drove the car 3 blocks in calm circles to warm the oil and reset the fuel economy readouts, topped off the tank at the corner station using my own debit card because the receipt was the point. Folded that receipt into my back pocket like a certificate of completion, and parked the car on our street, but not in our driveway. Choosing a spot 2 houses down where the morning sun would light the windshield and the neighbors would see our pride and ask questions my mother would not enjoy answering. When I returned the key to its cheerful hook by the mudroom door, I placed next to it a folded dish towel with a thin border of ribbon, the same ribbon that had been on yesterday's bow, now tied into a small, sober knot around a note barely larger than a business card that said, "Ask me for the pin when you are ready to talk like I exist," and I loaded my tote with documents and the shoebox of keepsakes that constitute a life when you strip away the narrative. And I left the house to run too. Errands that would make the afternoon unravel, no matter how bravely they smiled for Facebook. First, I visited the bank to deposit the last check my father had written for gas money, a tired, paternal drip that pretended to be generosity, and I endorsed it with the kind of flourish you use to sign treaties. Then I set a rule in my account that refused future deposits from the same source unless I accepted them manually, a practical boundary dressed like software. Second, I stopped at the grocery store for a small, inexpensive sheet cake with plain white frosting, asked the baker to pipe to the other daughter in tidy blue script, and I carried it back to our kitchen with the gravitas of a notary delivering a summons. I set the cake on the counter next to a single candle and a lighter I left purposefully empty of fuel, the visual joke quiet enough to pass as a mistake until the second glance turned it into indictment. By noon the house was buzzing with the early tremors of my little earthquake. Emily stormed in from the sidewalk asking why her car would not open the trunk and whether the system was glitching. My mother fluttered from room to room taking calls she described as nosy relatives being nosy, and my father stood in front of the cake with a look that could not tell whether he was being mocked or reminded, and when they asked, almost in chorus, if I had done something to the vehicle because the glove box was uncooperative, I said I had made it safer, that I had made all of us safer, that the code would arrive when we were ready to treat each other like people rather than props. And the phones kept pinging as cousins posted pictures from last night captioned with that innocent grenade, so sweet that the car surprise and the birthday were the same day. And I watched my mother type a paragraph, then delete it and type again, and in the little reflection of the microwave door I saw my own face steady and unfamiliar, like meeting someone you have finally decided to respect. Their first calls came an hour later when I stepped out to the porch with my bag and that waterproof envelope tucked under my arm, and I let the phone buzz until it wore itself out, because this was not a fight, it was a reallocation of attention. And I had spent enough years underwriting the family's myth. I snapped the suitcase handle up, breathed in the heat lifting off the pavement, and paused at the edge of the lawn because there was one last thing to do before the leaving could begin to count. Tomorrow I would lay the final piece on the kitchen table, a page that would make my father's mouth go slack and my mother's hands go still, a single sheet as plain as a receipt and twice as undeniable. And while the afternoon hummed with their confusion, I walked down the steps thinking about how a door can close without slamming when you finally learn how to turn the handle. By the time the afternoon thinned into that washed-out light that makes every suburban street look like a catalog page, I had rented a small studio across town with a month-to-month lease, signed my name with a hand that did not tremble, handed over the deposit I had been hoarding in a savings account no one but me could see, and texted my friend Mara the address with a simple promise that I would be out of the house before sunset. Then I drove back with the air conditioner whispering and the kind of calm that arrives only when the decision has already been made. On the passenger seat lay the single page I had prepared, printed on ordinary white paper that would be hard to dramatize and therefore impossible to ignore, a page that combined a boundary with instructions, a receipt with a map. And instead of writing a speech I would later regret, I let the page speak for me in a voice that could not crack. I walked into the kitchen without ceremony, moved the cake an inch to the left so the note would sit where no one could mistake it for clutter, and placed the page beside the empty lighter the way you lay a card in a game when you finally know the rules. The page began with 5 dates listed in full words the way you write on forms and legal documents, the last 5 birthdays that had slid past without acknowledgement, and next to each date I added a single verifiable fact, where I had been that day, who had texted me, what time my bank record showed I bought my own cupcake, not to shame them, but to anchor the pattern in something harder than feeling, below the dates I had typed, with crisp indifference, that I was formally revoking my parents' place as my emergency contacts and medical proxies, and naming Mara instead, enclosing copies of the signed forms not as drama but as logistics, a practicality that would hit my father like a thrown brick, because he loved nothing more than describing himself as the man who could be counted on in a crisis. Beneath that I had included a short paragraph about the car, written clean as a receipt. Valet mode would stay in place for 30 days unless we had a conversation with a licensed family therapist and agreed on a plan for repair, after which I would hand over the PIN and a small envelope with the insurance photographs and registration copies, and if they chose not to engage, the mode would lift automatically on the 31st day. Which meant this was not coercion, it was a clock, and all they had to do to stop hearing "Happy Birthday" to the other daughter flare across the dashboard was speak to me like I was real. The last paragraph was the one that would jolt my father's jaw loose, because I had listed the automatic transfers I had been making out of habit to keep the family phone plan and the streaming bundle alive since college. Small amounts that added up to a steady subsidy nobody had thanked me for, and I had scheduled those transfers to end at midnight, including a line that said they could either take over the accounts or allow them to lapse. but I would not fund the background of a life I was no longer invited to appear in, at the bottom, in a neat little box. I had stapled a card with the therapist's name and a temporary email address I created just for this process, and on a narrow strip of paper, I taped the first half of the 4-digit PIN like a riddle a reasonable person could solve. I did not stand around to watch the discovery because revenge loses heat when you hang over it explaining, so I took a small trash bag and, with unhurried hands, dismantled what was left of my room, a handful of paperbacks, a sweater my mother always said washed to a strange shape, the shoebox of ticket stubs and wristbands that remind you your life once contained strangers and music. And I set the bag by the door next to my suitcase and the tote with the documents arranged like a portable archive. Then I walked the hall one last time, pausing by the calendar where my tiny word still perched like a splinter in glossy paper, and I allowed myself a long breath that did not hitch. On the way out, I slid the extra key off my ring and placed it on the counter beside the cake, not as surrender, but as punctuation, because people who think they own you misunderstand what it means when you stop gripping their things. I took a photo of the counter, cake, lighter, page, key, then deleted it. Because proof was not the point anymore, peace was. In the driveway, my mother appeared holding her phone like a passport, her face practiced into cheerfulness that kept slipping, my father behind her with that brisk, managerial walk he used on waiters and cable technicians, and Emily hovering with a look that could pass for wounded. If you did not know her as well as I did, they asked if I had a minute, which meant they needed an hour, and I said I had a train to catch, which was a polite lie because I had a rideshare idling at the curb and a lease with my name on it waiting across town. My mother said relatives were confused about the timing of celebrations. My father said the Bluetooth name was immature. Emily asked for the trunk code in a voice she hoped would make me feel like a bully. And I told them the page on the counter would answer questions more accurately than whatever they were about to say. My father's mouth tightened. He asked what kind of stunt I was pulling, and I told him stunts end when the applause dies, but I was finished performing, and if they wanted me in their lives, they could meet me in a room where none of us were allowed to narrate over the other. I kissed my mother's cheek, which made her flinch and then reach for more. Hugged Emily in a way that reminded us both I had once been the person she called when she locked herself out, and I walked toward the idling car as my father barked my name the way you bark a command at a dog you think still returns when called. The driver asked if everything was okay, and I said we were finally behaving like honest people, which is messy at first, and as we pulled away I watched through the rear window while my mother re-entered the house. The bow from yesterday still slumped against the porch rail like a deflated parade, my father standing in the doorway with that posture he used when a storm gathered, and he pretended to calculate wind speeds. And I knew that in less than a minute he would read the first paragraph and then the second, and then the line about the proxies, and whatever theater they had planned for dinner would collapse into the kind of quiet that sounds like loss. My phone began to vibrate with the early shock. A call that turned into another call that turned into a text that said, "Only come back. We can talk," followed by another that said, "This is unnecessary," followed by a final one that landed like a stone in a glass. A photo of the page with my father's thumbnail in the corner, and the words, typed by my mother in that fussy, formal tone she uses for sympathy cards, "We do not need a stranger to fix private matters," and beneath it, before I could respond or decide not to, came Emily's message, not angry and not pleading. Just 4 words that threaded the needle in a way I did not anticipate. "What's the other half?" And as the car merged into traffic, I looked at the city unspooling ahead and realized the answer I would or would not send would decide who I became tomorrow. I sat on the windowsill of the studio that smelled faintly of fresh paint and steamed rice from the takeout place below, watching dusk iron the last shine out of the street, and I let the phone vibrate on the counter until the insistence of it became ridiculous. Then I picked up and read the messages stacked like receipts after a foolish shopping spree, my father's blocky sentences blustering toward logic while betraying panic, my mother's tidy paragraphs performing reasonableness while circling the real wound, and Emily's short requests arriving with a steadier pulse, each one asking for what she actually wanted rather than what the family image demanded. which told me more about who could be saved than anything anyone had said all week. When the therapist's office called to confirm the joint appointment I had reserved with a card that could easily be canceled, I heard my own voice say yes, I would attend if the others arrived in good faith, and the receptionist, gentle in a way. Clerks learn to be in offices where people present their best posture and their worst pain, said that families are great improvisers until a couch is involved, so I should not be surprised if truth shows up looking like a fight. They arrived late, which meant they were on time for themselves, and the waiting room hummed with the soft hum of magazines nobody reads anymore, and the therapist, a woman with kind eyes and an allergy to melodrama, asked us to stay with facts and to label feelings like we were filing them, and I spoke first not because I wanted the floor but because for once I did not want to be accused of ambush. I read the 5 dates and I described the 5th afternoon. The bow and the Bluetooth and the cake with blue script, and when my mother interrupted to say the cake was cruel, I told her the inscription was not a scream, it was a label, and labels are the only language our house ever honored. My father, who had rehearsed a speech about being old school and not big on birthdays, found his mouth stumbling over the simple admission that he did not remember the day itself without my mother's calendar to tell him. And when the therapist asked him to try right then, with no help and no glance at the phone, his guess was wrong by a week, and the room swallowed a long, dull silence that felt like proof sliding across the table to face the right pair of eyes. Emily, who had been hugging her purse as if it contained a passport to somewhere better, confessed that she had suspected for years the balance was off, that she knew attention collected around her like lint because every little decision about her schedule, her stress level, her safety, turned into a family project, and that our mother called this vigilance, but it felt like a spotlight she could not turn off, and that sometimes she wished I would throw a fit just to change the air. Then she looked at me and, in a voice that did not beg and did not accuse, asked if she could please have the second half of the code, because not being able to open her own trunk made her feel like a child. And I told her that adulthood is a series of locks you learn not to resent, and I would hand her the second half when she proved she knew the things that mattered, not the vanity items our house called facts. The therapist tilted her head and asked me to define the things that mattered, and I said that. Where I was concerned, the list started with my full name and the date that kept disappearing, and then I turned to my father and asked him to say both, slowly and without help, and after he stared at his shoes long enough for the room to grow a second silence, Emily said my name and my date with a care that made the word sound newly minted, and I took the folded strip from my pocket and slid it into her palm, a quiet transaction that broke the performance we had been staging for decades, because it made the line between trust and access visible in a way no speech can. My mother cried then, not the pretty tears she does at graduations, but the kind that crumple a person's face into childhood. And she said that after her father died, she developed a superstition about birthdays that made it easier to over-celebrate one child and under-acknowledge the other, because the glitter and noise around Emily felt like proof that no more bad things would happen, while my quiet confidence felt like a safe place to stash the guilt. And she said the sentence that had been trying to escape her throat since the first paragraph of my page, that she made a bargain with herself to keep Emily bright so the house would feel alive, and in that bargain I was always cast as the capable one who did not need fuss, and she did not realize the bargain required me to pay forever. The therapist asked whether a bargain that nobody signed can be enforced, and my father, whose face had been hardening into the kind of stubbornness that gets men through layoffs and makes them insufferable at Thanksgiving, made a sound I had only ever heard when he sprained his back lifting a grill, and his eyes went bright, and he said he had always thought love was the long game of providing, that as long as bills got paid and cars stayed insured the rest could be assumed, and he asked how many months I had been covering the little gaps without telling them, and when I answered, in full words because digits felt too clinical for grief, he closed his eyes and leaned back the way men do when they have finally found the exact weight of something they can no longer lift alone. We did not fix anything in 60 minutes, because 60 minutes cannot reassign roles written over years, yet something unshowy and irrevocable changed when Emily opened her purse and handed me the extra key I had already returned. And she asked me to keep it not because I was safe, but because she wanted to be the person who chose me, and my mother, swallowing the last of her pride in dry gulps, asked whether I would consider sending the therapist's card to the relatives who had been texting advice, and my father, with a voice he must have borrowed from a gentler man, asked if he could add me back as an emergency contact someday when I felt they had earned the right to call. I said that earning is not a switch but a ledger, and it would be open from now on, and then I stood because the hour was done, and I told them that I would not be returning to the family plan, to the streaming bundle, to the calendar squares where my life was an afterthought, but that on the 1st of next month I would meet them again in this room if they wished, and that for now the car could remain a classroom where we learn the difference between entitlement and permission. On the sidewalk, my father caught up and asked, with a humility that did not look borrowed anymore, whether the Bluetooth name would always say what it said, and I told him that the system lets you edit labels when you are ready to rename the thing you keep ignoring. And he laughed without humor and said that some labels should never have needed printing. Then he folded in on himself in a way that frightened me and steadied me at the same time, and I believed, briefly and dangerously, that he might actually change. I walked to the corner where the bus hissed and the sky lowered into that deep violet that carries people home, and my phone vibrated with a new message from an unknown number that turned out to be my mother's, because she had created a fresh contact instead of texting from the old thread, and the message was one long sentence with no decoration that said she had written my birthday in ink on every calendar she owned and taped it to the inside of the pantry door where she keeps the measuring cups, and that she would not ask me to come for dinner, not yet, only to tell her whether the frosting on the cake should be changed to plain white or left as it is until the lesson is learned. I did not answer, not because I wanted to be cruel, but because some endings have to echo before you trust the silence, and I boarded the bus with my tote against my knees and the strip of paper missing from my pocket. And I closed my eyes while the city slid by in sheets of light, and I thought about how a door left on the latch can still keep out a storm, and how, if you walk away carefully enough, the house you left might learn how to stop pretending you were a shadow and start learning your name in full.